So what's happened over the last few years is that a class of models that we've come to call deep learning has become very popular and has attracted a lot of attention because it started working really well. The ideas at the basis of deep learning actually go back a long time, around the late 80s, early 90s, and they were quite well developed there. But the data sets that we used to train them were not very big at the time, and with a few exceptions. And the computers that we had weren't fast enough really to train very large learning systems. And so what is deep learning really? So the classical model of pattern recognition is that you take your raw signal and you ask a bunch of scientists or engineers to essentially massage the data in such a way that it would be digestible by a simple learning procedure, a classifier, what we call a classifier. And the learning takes place generally in the classifier. That model has been the basis of machine learning, big data, data mining, all those things that you hear about since the 50s until fairly recently. What deep learning changes in that model is that a deep learning model is based on the idea that the data gets processed as a sequence with a sequence of modules. That's the idea of deep. It's because it's got multiple layers. And all of those modules are trainable end-to-end. So you give the machine an image or a text or speech or whatever it is, and then you tell it the answer, and all of those modules get trained.
Machine learning, I like to think of, and Jan has some really great examples, as kind of a science 2.0. And if we go back to roughly 1600, the scientific method was developed by this guy, considered the grandfather of science, the scientific method. That's Galileo Galilei. And with some co-conspirators like Francis Bacon, he developed this approach of how do we come up with science. So the idea is you start off with a hypothesis. Some scientist thinks about how the world works. So maybe the scientist says, I think the Earth rotates around the sun. And then he goes out and he collects some data. And then with that data set, he says, can I support this hypothesis versus the null hypothesis? And you can see this being very closely related to A/B testing and so on. So science has plodded along like this for hundreds of years, for about 400, half a millennium. And this is a great model, but recently things have changed. So what has changed is machine learning, as Jan is describing, really inverts this approach. So instead of having a scientist sit there under a tree and think, let me think of an idea of how things work, you don't sit and think of an idea, you collect massive data sets. And then you say, let me think of billions of ideas, hypotheses by the billions and trillions. You do this algorithmically. You don't sit there and think of each one. And then you say, with this data set, which of these ideas stick? Which ones have support in the data? And you have to do this with two things. You have to do it with computational efficiency. You don't want to go out and try every single idea and every single data point. That's just too inefficient. So you have to explore this massive space of light bulbs. And you also have to do it with statistical efficiency. You have to trust the hypotheses you found, because even a broken clock is right twice a day. And if you have enough ideas, you'll find a few that by fluke are correct. So you have to also be able to trust statistically the ideas you discover this way.
The AI-enabled world is like moving extremely fast. I mean, most of us know that and perceive it, but I think it's moving even faster than we are expecting. The thing is that this has a big cultural shift on R&D organizations. And how do we adapt to this? Back when I was pitching autonomous vehicle, people kept on saying, oh, what provable guarantee do you have that your black box statistical model or like neural networks are going to work? And I didn't quite know how to answer, right? But at some point I came up with this answer. I got tired and I said, what provable guarantees do you have on this guy? And since you have none, why do you give him this, right? And this is a cultural shift. We are giving people driving license, but we don't have provable guarantees. And the industry at the time was rejecting this idea of like learning things on data and just like deploying, right? But in reality, we are allowing people to drive. So this cultural shift is very important.
I don't believe in the concept of the singularity. I think people are a little deluded by the fact that when you have a process, a physical process, a social process going on, the initial phase of it always looks exponential because the friction terms haven't kicked in yet. And then as soon as things start accelerating, you start seeing the effect of friction terms. Limitations in communication speed, in social inertia, in all kinds of problems. And so there's nothing that looks more like a sigmoid than the beginning of an exponential. So I don't believe we're going to see a complete takeoff of AI. If history is a guide, people have been overly optimistic about the success of AI for decades. And so if you ask most researchers in AI and you ask them, when will we have human level artificial general intelligence, a lot of people will say, it's going to take more than 20 years. And whenever someone tells you a technology is going to take more than 20 years, that means they have absolutely no idea how long it's going to take.